Konnichiwa. This is Richard from 8020 Japanese, and in this video we're going to look at how Japanese verbs are structured. Instead of looking at one verb form at a time, we're going to see the basic rules that apply to all Japanese verb forms. Once you understand how Japanese verbs are structured, then you'll know exactly what to expect every time you learn a new verb form, and that just makes them easier to learn. So let's start by using the word eat as an example, which in Japanese is tabemasu. Like all Japanese verbs, we can break this down into two parts. There's the verb stem, which is tabe in this case, and that tells us what action is being described. That's the part that tells us that it's eating that we're talking about. Now, for some verbs, the stem never changes. It doesn't matter what form we put it in, it always stays the same. For some other verbs, however, the last sound of the verb stem will change depending on the verb form. In this case, eat, the verb stem is always tabe. It doesn't matter what form we put it in, it's always going to be tabe. For some verbs, however, the last sound in the verb stem changes according to the verb form. It does do this in a predictable way though. We'll look at an example of that in a moment. The other part of the verb is the verb ending. Now this tells us two things. It tells us what tense or form the verb is in, and it also tells us the degree of politeness where applicable. In this particular case, the mas ending tells us that it's the polite present future tense. It tells us that it's polite, and it tells us that it's the present future tense. You might have noticed, by the way, that I just said tabemasu and not tabemasu. This is because the u part of the su sound at the end of verbs like this is usually just not pronounced. The ending is typically just pronounced mas. So this is tabemasu. Let's now take a look at some of the different ways that we can conjugate this particular verb, tabemasu. We start with tabemasu, and we take the verb stem and we change the ending from mas to mashita. And that puts it in the polite past tense. The mas ending is the polite present future tense. The mashita ending is the polite past tense. As I said, the verb stem never changes for this particular verb. So in the next form as well, the stem is tabe and the ending is masen. Tabemasen. And that's the polite negative form of the present future tense, to not eat. Another form of this verb is taberu. This is the informal present future tense. It's the same as tabemasu in terms of meaning, it's just less polite than tabemasu. It's the informal form, whereas tabemasu is the polite form. This form is sometimes referred to as the plain form or the dictionary form, and that's because it's kind of the base form that is usually what's used in dictionaries. If you need to look up a verb in the dictionary, this is the form that it will be shown in. Lastly, we have tabenai. Again, we have tabe as the stem and then nai as the ending. And that's the informal negative present future tense form, tabenai. That's to not eat in the informal form, whereas tabemasen was to not eat in the polite form. So as you can see here, the stem of the verb doesn't change. It's always tabe. And then we just change the verb ending to change it into a different form. And that can have a different meaning, like a different functional form, or it can be a different level of politeness. Now let's take a look at another verb, but this time we'll look at one that has a stem that changes in certain forms. That verb is nomimasu, which means drink. So like tabemasu, nomimasu is the polite present future tense of this verb. As I said, the stem of this verb changes depending on the verb form. But even though the stem changes depending on the verb form, there are sensible rules for that. It's not too difficult to learn. It's particularly easy in the polite forms because the stem in the polite verb forms doesn't change. The polite past tense is nomimasu. Just like with tabemashita, the stem hasn't changed, and we've just changed the ending from mas to mashita. Nomimasu. That means drink in the past tense, or drank. Also, in the negative polite form, the stem is also the same, and we get nomimasen. The stem has remained the same, and we've changed the ending to masen. And that gives us the polite negative form of the present future tense. The next form is where we see things change. The informal present future tense is nomu. Now, we're not going to go into the rules of the different stem changes here, but you can see already that mi and mu are pretty similar. They're both from the ma line of the syllabary. Even though the stem has changed, there is a recognizable pattern, and this is pretty easy to learn when we come to it. Another form where the stem changes partially is the informal negative form of the present future tense, which becomes nomimasu. Again, we can see we're using ma, which is also from the ma line, just like mi and mu. Again, there is a recognizable pattern to the way that the stem changes when it does. The other thing to note here is that the verb ending, nai, is the same as it was for tabemasu, to eat, which was tabenai in the informal negative form. Tabenai and nomimanai. The verb ending will always be the same for a particular verb form, and then the stem is mostly the same depending on the verb. If you marry those two together, it makes the verb forms in Japanese really quite predictable. So the rules are quite simple and straightforward. We have a verb stem, and that tells us what the action is that has been described. So if it's eat, it's always tabe, and if it's drink, it's nomi or something like nomi. As I said, for some verbs that last sound changes, but it changes in a fairly predictable way. Then we have the verb ending, and this tells us the tense or form that the verb is in, including whether it's positive or negative, as well as whether or not it's polite or informal. Altogether, Japanese verbs are really quite predictable. We have the stem, which tells us what the action is, and then the ending, which tells us the tense or the form, as well as whether it's polite or informal. This is great because it means we don't have to spend time learning individual verb conjugations for different verbs, which is sometimes the case in other languages. We just need to learn the base verb and then apply the appropriate ending, and maybe manipulate the stem a little bit if we need to. Then we get the verb that we want in the form that we want. And now you know how Japanese verbs are structured. Now you just need to go and learn the different forms and when to use them. One quick way to get started with that is to grab a free copy of my Guide to Japanese Verb Tenses and Forms. This PDF cheat sheet has one page with all the rules showing you how to conjugate verbs into the major verb forms, plus another page full of examples showing you how to apply these rules. Just follow the link in the description to grab your free copy. That's all for now. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Yoroshiku onegai shimasu.